Hello, everyone. We're back with episode 42. Today, here with us is Elke Schwarz, and we're very excited about this topic that we wanted to talk for a very long time, and we finally get a chance to hear from a very, very accomplished person. So, Elke, a few words about yourself for our attendees on a need-to-know basis, as I love to say. So, whatever you think is working for today's live.
Yes, yes, there's a couple of facets which I will leave out. Thanks for having me on your show. Thanks for tuning in. So I am Elke Schwarz. I am Professor of Political Theory at Queen Mary University in London. And I am also Vice Chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. And I have worked on the topic that we're discussing today, that is military artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, emerging technologies, and the ethics and politics of these new kinds of systems and how they shape how we think about warfare and violence. For over a decade, I've written a book on the subject matter called Death Machines, where I think a little bit more theoretically about the ethics of warfare in the environment of technology. And I've been very fortunate to have been able to engage in the conversations about trying to regulate autonomous weapon systems, thinking through the pitfalls, the problems, and the challenges of new military technologies, artificial intelligence for military purposes, with many wonderful colleagues and with a number of NGOs for the better part of last decade. So it is a field of research that I enjoy very much, but it is also, of course, a terribly grim topic.
Let's start with the grim topic. I think let's dive right in. So our the title for today's episode is the first word is misconceptions, right? And we were talking about some of those during our prep call for today's episode. So let's briefly speak about the existing misconceptions when it comes to military AI and lethal autonomous weapons. All the green stuff that you mentioned.
Yes, so it's difficult to distinguish sometimes between what is a misconception and what is a hype and what is the actual utility of artificial intelligence, not least because for the defense sector and in military environments, not least because, of course, artificial intelligence can be used in many ways for defense organizations and military environments. And just like in our normal professional mundane office life, for example, artificial intelligence is quite useful to streamline processes or to optimize logistics processes or to, in the defense context, for example, the earliest or an earlier way of thinking about useful implementation of artificial intelligence is in predictive maintenance. You can use it for translations and all those things. Where it gets a little bit more thorny is where artificial intelligence is used in order to arrive at decisions that normally humans would make, specifically targeting decisions, and accelerating the kill chain or accelerating the lethal action chain, simply because there are some issues, and most professionals that work with artificial intelligence will say, well, AI is only ever as good as the data it is trained on and the data it has to work with. And for defense contexts and military contexts, where the environment is always relatively dynamic, that poses some challenges. And so while the current mood and tenor of the conversations is that artificial intelligence will help significantly in order to win war, and those very often hyperbolic marketing promises, there is no evidence necessarily for that, right? It's a way of mythologizing a technology that may, in some instances, work only poorly or unreliably, or also requires a lot of updates in order to remain relevant. So bringing that into the targeting cycle, bringing that into, let's say, weapon systems to make them increasingly autonomous is a very risky bet, and by no means a certain advantage in all instances. So I think sometimes we have to be mindful about the consequences of artificial intelligence and bringing it in. And sometimes we simply have to be mindful what kind of AI we're talking about, because AI is not this one monolithic thing, but it is rather a computational process that can be used for a number of things and works better in a closed environment where you can control the parameters to a certain degree, and it works less well in really complex, very dynamic and uncertain environments where data is not readily available to keep the system up to date.
Yeah, so talking about autonomous weapon systems and targeting, I've been thinking about this topic, prepping for the episode. As warfare becomes less and less human, I would say we see less and less human involvement. Do you think at some point it makes it more likely the next war, so to speak? Does it make it the fact that there will be a next war or something? Does it make it more likely to happen, since there are not really people involved in sometimes in the decision making? Skinny IT guy somewhere, I don't know, at his basement can just press the button. I'm exaggerating big time right now. Can press a button, and somewhere hundreds and hundreds of people can die. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's two ways to think about that. So on one hand, there is a way by which the capabilities of the technology and the logic of the technology, the affordances of the technology, in, let's say, identifying targets and then facilitating the acceleration of actioning those targets, let's say, by which the logic of speed and scale is seductive in expanding circles of violence. And this is not necessarily new, right? So in the early days of drone warfare, when targeted killing became normalized in the context of drones and algorithmic target identification, the infamous pattern of life analysis for signature strikes rather than personality strikes. So that started with the idea that you can have a whole bunch of data that you can evaluate, and then you can evaluate faster and potentially more precise what is a good target and what's not a good target. And human decision makers are kind of slightly more dissociated from being involved in this ultimately moral decision. And then you have a drone platform which can enact this, which is remotely operated. So the cost of enacting that violent decision is much lower. So there's a convenience factor, and then there's a cost factor. And what we've said from the beginning with the context of drone warfare is that has the potential to lower the threshold to the use of force, because it's less costly and it's more convenient. And that as a complex makes it perhaps more seductive. And, in the context of drone warfare, and perhaps we can translate that into the use of AI decision support systems and increasingly autonomous type of systems that are AI enabled, we might surmise that kind of condition of a lower threshold to the use of force and an expansion of violence rather than a restraint in the use of violence on account of what the system affords will, become more pronounced even the more the system takes on that decision function, which is ultimately always a moral decision function. But to your earlier point, when you say we see less and less humans involved in war, I don't necessarily think that is true. I think necessarily we will see different nodes and places where human decision makers will still make decisions, for example, using such systems. But war is something that is fought amongst humans. And I think what we'll see is that at the receiving end, there will always be humans affected, right? So it's not becoming less human. It becomes perhaps more devastatingly inhumane. But that doesn't mean that the humans are taken out. It just means that humans have a tool at their disposal, which might make it easier to inflict violence without a significant moral cost, felt moral cost. The moral cost is always there, but the significant felt moral cost and accountability for the decision to inflict that violence. But I think the humans will remain. We just have to think a little bit about what kinds of tools we're using in order to wage the wars. And I very often, I'm sure people who know me are kind of sick of me talking about Chris Coker, who was a military scholar, and he was very much on point with thinking about the relationship between humans and their technology for warfare. And he was quite insightful when he says, as humans, we always avail ourselves of certain technologies, but we have to be mindful and careful what kind of weapons we choose, what kind of tools we use, because the more we come to rely on them and their logic, the more this will shape our practice itself. And so if it is tools of, accelerating violent decision making, then this is the harvest that we get ultimately.
I wanted to briefly talk about, we mentioned misconceptions, and yes, the AI tools are not only used in the back end as everybody thinks. What are some good applications of AI in the military that you know of, and that maybe some of the people might not be aware?
I think there are actually quite many, I would say. So, I mentioned the predictive maintenance AI systems, which sort of just identify what is a weak point in an object, ahead of time so that they can be fixed before something terrible happens. But just any kind of logistical sort of back office application, maybe sift through emails or something that is not critical in its use, and something perhaps anything that optimizes the movement of objects, right? Where it's not about human dynamics, but where it's about taking objects from A to B, or thinking about optimizing the flow of objects ultimately, or non-human data as such. And in some ways, surely it can help sift through a lot of data, make suggestion, but there we have to begin to be very careful about where we see ourselves, where the role as humans in that configuration, because very often we overestimate the agency that we have in a human machine teaming kind of environment, especially with systems that are cognitively much faster than ourselves, and where we have a tendency to overtrust, or engage in or be seduced by what is called automation bias, right? There's a long scholarship that says, embedded in computational systems, when a computational system makes a decision and suggests that decision to us, there's certain psychological modes by which we tend to trust that decision rather than try and overrule it, or find contrary information, or take the time to question it. So our relationship within the AI configuration, where AI is supposed to serve just as a tool, that we have to be very mindful of our own limitations as much as the system's limitations as such. But there are many, just like in our normal life, there's many ways by which you can use AI to sort things, to streamline things, to categorize and optimize things. But you hear me say things and objects rather than humans. And I think this, for me, is the significant part.
Yeah, thank you, Elke. I think we also wanted to kind of discuss something that's been happening, and I think has been in the news that probably many people saw. What is happening with the military and the tech industry kind of getting kind of more intertwined? I mean, we've known for many decades that defense contractors and defense companies have contracts with all kinds of software companies for different technologies. But what we have been seeing in the news is that the tech executives being kind of accepted as reservists in the army. So that's a really interesting trend, and yeah, I would love for you maybe to talk about that a little bit. What's going on there, do you think?
Well, I'm not entirely sure fully what's going on there, but I have my suspicions and I have my theories. So maybe I'll start with this piece of news that you allude to, and that was a swearing in of I think it was 4 technology executives from, you know, one was from Palantir, the CTO of Palantir, and he was kind of instrumental in bringing about this, you know, production or the calling into being of what is called Detachment 201, whereby technology executives are sworn into the US Army Reserves at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and it was all done in a spectacular ceremony. And it included the CTO from Palantir, but also technology officers and executives from Meta, from OpenAI, and a former OpenAI executive, which is now with the Thinking Machine Lab. And so they were sworn into the Army Reserves at a relatively high rank, I should say. You know, some say that it takes years, if not a good decade, to reach the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. And this normalizes and perhaps even glamorizes the standing and involvement of technology executives, technology people, technology expertise in the military space, but without really considering what the military profession is more about holistically. Add to that these executives allegedly or reportedly don't really have to do the full training regime. They're also not going to be called on to risk their lives. So the idea presented via the media or to the media and via the media to us was that this will help the Army gain, you know, high-level technology expertise, and this will benefit the various operations and is definitely an asset. Now, interestingly, some say this was not necessary at all because there are many, many ways in which these technology companies can bid, can involve themselves, can do various stints, and military personnel can do stints in these technology companies. So there are various schemes already available. So it's a question of what this merger and blending of military technology executives, military technology companies that are not normally in that space, specifically Meta and OpenAI and some others, what this blending ultimately does. And I think what it does is perhaps, among other things, a cementing of the notion that war is primarily a software problem, which of course it is not. As I alluded to earlier, war is a human problem. It requires, to end war, you require a social and political solution and not just a technology solution. But it kind of really cements this complex that war, technology, and business is kind of a little bit all the same. And so we've seen a very interesting kind of emergence of new financial influx, especially venture capital money coming into the space as well. And that is, you know, the early history of all of that notwithstanding, that is unusual. So in the last 2 decades, venture capital was not really interested in funding military startups or military companies because the market was quite consolidated. But with this opening up of war being a software problem and military startups really gaining some traction in the military space, the funding, of course, also flows differently. Now, notwithstanding, of course, or we have to take into consideration, of course, that there's a ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine since 2022. And other conflicts around the globe, right? So Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, these are not the only conflicts. There are many other conflicts that are actually live as we speak. But it became a little bit more palatable, especially with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, to say, well, you know, we do need to defend values, and to do that, if war is a software problem, we need more technology companies. And where there are technology startups, there's venture capital money. And so the narrative has shifted a little bit. Now, I want to say that the military-industrial complex has been, you know, alive and well for many, many decades. And it's by no means unproblematic that a handful of prime companies dominate the defense space. But what we're seeing is a shift towards domination now by certain software companies, which is supported by extraordinary amounts of venture capital money influx and extraordinary valuations of these companies. And that drives, of course, the idea forward that this is the future. But it also produces certain narratives, because venture capital is risk capital. And in order to make good returns, you need to kind of embrace some risk, but you also need to be sure that you place your bets on at least 2, 3, 4 really, really extremely strong companies, and you support them with all that you have so that they can scale really fast and gain quick valuations. Because the product for venture capital companies is not the technology companies. The product for them is growth. So they have to produce growth. How do we produce growth? Well, we need to support certain companies that are very promising, and we need to support them in developing their products. And in this instance, the ongoing wars have tragically provided a great opportunity for these companies to develop their products and test them in live contexts. Foregrounding of prototyping and then testing them out has become a little bit more commonplace. Embracing of risk has become a little bit more commonplace. So certain political economy dynamics have shifted with the advent of the ethos that war is a software problem, and that there's a big and important space for military startups across, multiple regions, but it was certainly driven from the US at first.
Hey, briefly, Alisa, I'm sorry. I'm gonna chip in. Talking about the concentration of power, obviously in the US we have those big AI companies, the likes of Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and XAI, which incidentally, recently it was announced got a very, very good $200 million defense contract with the Pentagon, right? Is there a possibility, and I would think there is, that it's still a free market. There's still companies, they need to sell their product. That at some point, OpenAI or Google or Anthropic, they would make a deal with some other country. They'll sell their software and their product to another country, not necessarily the enemy, whoever this might be, but what's there to stop them, so to speak, right? They are selling their product. That's all they're doing.
Yeah.
They're not only dealing with the US government, so to speak. So as we know, OpenAI also signed a deal with the UK government. So how does this kind of mix in with this whole narrative of they are so intertwined to the point of it's going to be very difficult to, unravel all of that when they're kind of getting their hands in different pies all over the world, different countries. They're having contracts and deals with different governments. So where's the national security in this, do you think?
That's challenging to think about. Now, in some ways, weapons companies have always not only sold to one state, right? So there's a domestic defense industry, but there are some key international players, very often situated in the US, but also some British companies and, German companies. And so there's not like a national security mandate that a company has to be domestically located and can only sell to a particular government or state. And I think the same applies for those companies that you have just mentioned. But what is different in this sense is that you have companies that are US companies that are dual use companies now, because initially many of them were just like in the civilian context, right? So Microsoft has had contracts with various defense organizations for many, many years. And I think Google has as well. You have to think about cloud services such as Amazon has as well. So, there's some sense by which this dual use thing has also always existed, or to some degree existed. But with companies like Meta and Anthropic in particular, I was very interested to learn that they are now in the game as well. So it suggests that there's a lot of money to be had through government contracts, which of course, government money is also in some ways taxpayer money. But what is also different about these kinds of companies is not that they're producing hardware that then can be, had or purchased, and maybe you have an agreement for upkeep and servicing, but they're data companies ultimately. So the question is, like, whose data are they dealing with? Do they have access to? Where are the firewalls between the UK's data trove not being used for training the system for something else? And it becomes a little bit of a challenging model, if you will, right? But this, of course, this is well underway. So Palantir has US contracts with the government, including the Defense Department, but it also has MOD UK contracts. It also has a contract with the UK National Health Service. So, there's a lot going on by which certain companies have developed certain infrastructures. And of course, the more you're locked into that infrastructure, the more lucrative it is for the company. And that's not necessarily, nationalistically or, based on national security. We also have to consider NATO, of course, in that configuration, because if NATO has a contract with a certain company and it provides a data infrastructure, let's say for a digital targeting kind of service, then other NATO countries or all NATO countries may have to kind of plug into it in some ways or another. So interoperability becomes really, really important, and confuses perhaps the idea of national security or national sovereignty for data. So I think there's a bit of a scramble at the moment to start thinking about how one deals with data sovereignty. But the challenge is there, but the challenge isn't just there with companies that perhaps want to develop their business, because the primary drive for every business is business development. At least that's what I was taught in my business degree many years ago, right? Business development. So that interest has to be balanced against national security interests of any respective state that does dealings with a business. But you also have then questions about, I was reading an article about technology sovereignty and Europe developing its own domestic, defense AI infrastructure or ecology. But of course, even that is propped up with US venture capital money. So it's not easy to draw lines, and perhaps one shouldn't draw lines because that can also lead to animosities. But one should have a clear view as to what the consequences are and where the challenges lie, and where the risks are ultimately.
Yeah, Elke, since you mentioned US, EU, UK, I think that might be kind of a good segue into talking a little bit about the difference in approaches, US versus, UK, for example, because you're also the UK expert, or maybe there are no differences. Maybe, these two kind of approaches are kind of converging as we speak. So if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the US and the UK, or the UK rather with the US, has long, they've been very, very close allies. They continue to be close allies. And in any kind of discussions that I was able to partake or listen in, it seemed always that, the UK is working with the US hand in glove. That was often the phrase that was used, hand in glove. And again, questions of interoperability here come to the fore. But what strikes me at the moment is the tone that the UK is adopting in terms of presenting its own, let's say, the strategic defense review or national security strategy. The tone strikes me as very, let's say, technology industry inflected, right? There are certain terms that are present in the strategic defense review that had previously not really been a terminology that the UK had used. For example, warfighter, right? It was service personnel or something other than warfighter. But warfighter is a term that came to more prominence in the last decade, perhaps in the US as well, although it's always existed, of course. But, I read it much more often in the literature and marketing materials of military startups. It's a term that was quite liberally used also in the Defense Innovation Unit reports. And so it's interesting that the US language seems to gravitate towards this kind of American term. Other things like lethality or 10x, or, like something that, having read a number of integrated reviews and national security strategies, makes me, pause and think, well, where does, how come this change in language and change in terminology? And, the way we use language and words and frames and themes, it does matter for one's perspective, and shaping an outlook. So the question always is, to what degree is the UK at this point really influenced by the influences of the technology industry and technology sector, which is known to lobby quite intensely, whether that's through various VC companies or quite powerful technology companies themselves. There's a significant lobby work that is going on, and which is quite intransparent. It's not like a big register where you can look up who's lobbying in what ways. So, the suspicion is a little bit that there's an undue influence by the technology industry on the UK policy-making frameworks at the moment. So I'm following that closely, but at the moment, I can't really see anything other than a continuation, perhaps even a strengthening or tightening of this hand-in-glove approach. But to what degree that is beneficial to the UK's national interest, and to what degree it will actually help the UK grow its economy, that's a question that I ask myself, especially because there's a potential that there's a huge AI hype underway, or a bubble which might burst. And then if you put most of your eggs in the AI promise basket, and that doesn't pan out, that's obviously not a good position to be in. So it'll be an interesting future for the UK, I think, with its current strategy, which strikes me as very tech forward, adopting a deregulatory kind of outlook, less focused on safeguards and guardrails, more focused on driving innovation and growth forward. And that sounds to me very much like VC language and, startup language.
Yeah, it definitely does. As you mentioned, I mean, growth is almost like this religious concept. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but to me, yeah, I've been in the tech industry for a very long time, and there is always, growth is the paramount of, everything. Whatever happens, you need to grow. So yeah, it's kind of a very interesting to me. But I think we also discussed in our prep call, it's like, the marriage of the military and tech, if you will, is nothing very new.
Mm-hmm.
There is I think also kind of a common understanding, or maybe kind of a presumption, that whatever something new in the tech world is being created or developed, the military would get their hands on it as a matter of priority. And maybe we will not even know about this, but they've been playing with this tech maybe for quite a while. So what's, it's nothing new in terms of like how they interoperate, tech and the military, but what's unique about this phase where we're at today? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the history of Silicon Valley, or technology, the military, and also venture capital is actually, quite tightly knit. It goes back to the 40s and 50s when, a sense of emergency made it a priority to develop technology or find ways to inject cash into perhaps high-risk endeavors, which would then benefit the military. And that relationship kind of grew together, into where we are today, but everybody took a slightly different pathway. But what I would say is that the early days of, technology and computational technology and military environments is what is a kind of a different hierarchy. It used to be that there were military requirements. The military knew what it needed. It was also willing to say, why don't you try this? Why don't you try this? So there was a sense by which military requirements determined or drove what the technology industry kind of turns its attention to. Not saying like we need exactly that, but a sense by which, it was clear that experimentation comes through the military perspective. Then it is developed in the technology sector. And then technology that was useful for the military finds its way into the civilian sector. Now, then the civilian sector became a lot more lucrative. But where we are right now is a bit of an inversion, I would say, whereby some of the military technology companies have products where they say, this will be useful for you, right? And we can find a use for you. It's like that contract that the UK has done with, I think it's OpenAI. It's not a contract, it's an agreement, it's a memorandum of understanding by which, the government says, well, we work with OpenAI to figure out what we can use these products for in government, right? So it is more of an inversion where you have a technology where somebody produces something and then they go, how might we use this in the military context? And I think that's the difference, the greatest difference that I see at the moment is that it's a different driver at work, and the driver tends to be a civilian type of technology, and the ethos within the civilian technology that has been developed over the last 2 decades, and its mandate towards fast growth, development, agility, and iteration, and those kinds of principles and ideas and perspectives are now entering military practices in ways that, where the relationship wasn't going this way, it was going the other way before. And I think there's a difference there. It's also facilitated by the fact that, the technology sector is a sector that has less restriction in moving fast and breaking things, to, employ the well-known trope. And it is valorized in some ways, right? It's about beating the competition, getting out ahead. It is about winning, but it is about winning the business competition. And in the military, the hierarchies are different. The ideas about why you need to do that, why you need to do product development, why you need to, experiment, were traditionally very different. So aligning those two comes with, cutoffs and risks and challenges. But I'm not entirely sure there's a good alignment at this point as the relationship between those two sectors try to kind of like align themselves a little bit more. But yeah, for me, that's the greatest difference to the traditional relationship between Silicon Valley and the military and venture capital. And similarly with the primes, I think it was a cost structure, right? So out of this relationship between technology and military in the 40s and 50s came this prime defense contractor structure by which, again, certain principles and relationships were instituted between the Defense Department and these big companies, these big defense companies, that obviously benefited the defense companies, and they have done a lot of lobbying, just like the military tech companies and the VCs attached to them do now. But again, as a different structure, was a different dynamic, and there was also perhaps potentially a slightly different sense of oversight in relation to what we're seeing right now, because the tech sector isn't necessarily known for its greatest embrace of regulatory guardrails.
Yeah, that's that's a really good way to put it. It's just basically, let's build a product, get it in the hands of the customer, and then we'll see what happens. But I'm thinking that also, and what we've been talking about is that because the nature of the tech itself is so quintessentially different than anything we have seen before. I personally don't quite buy an analogy where they say, we've seen electricity before, we've seen like industrial revolution, we've seen the print press, we've seen the intranet, and this is another wave of tech that is being unleashed onto us in like all these different ways. But I feel that especially with warfare and military, AI capabilities are just so the ramifications could be much much more serious, and also because of the nature of the tech itself, of how omni-use and ubiquitous it is. So what do you think about that? Because to
Yeah.
me, this is what makes kind of the biggest difference in how we should approach those things.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest difference, well, there's a number of big differences, I think. One is certainly, again, like we have to think about the inner logic of this. So on one hand, let's talk about military artificial intelligence for the targeting cycle, right? So let's say artificial intelligence for decision support systems, and that system would go through a bunch of data and not just identify a pre-stipulated target, but based on a certain pattern and a set of parameters, discover the targets and then suggest it to operators, and then a targeting decision is made. Just so we're clear about the type of system that I'm talking about here. So what happens with that? It's a system that is much more comprehensive in the way it embeds the human, right? It kind of takes on a cognitive function. It's not the physical prosthesis as such, a rifle or a tank or, another type of instrument, although every technology has a way to guide processes and shape perspectives, but it's so comprehensive in the way it takes on cognitive functions of decision making, and then kind of demands that the human cognitive mode aligns with it in some ways. And in order to not lose the advantage of the capabilities of the system, which is speed and scale, the human can't then slow everything down ultimately, right? So the human has to then, wherever they sit in whatever loop, on, by, in, has to kind of align functionally with the logic and the priorities of the system. And that is very comprehensive. And that involves mental processes much more than physical processes, to some degree, physical processes as well, if you want to talk about AI-enabled robotic systems. But it is really that cognitive takeover, cognitive capture that I'm most concerned about, because warfare is about life and death. It is so morally charged. And when we take away that human factor, that of course can be terrible, but can also be instrumental in enacting restraint. And this is what laws are all about. This is what the ethics of war is all about, enacting restraint, which is what we should strive for. So if that is kind of diluted or taken away or eroded or undermined, that for me is very problematic. And then that's the ethical and kind of like practical dimension in some ways, but add to that the fact that many technology experts that I talk to will say, still to this day, that AI is not ready for these kinds of tasks. It's nowhere near reliable enough, nowhere near. And so if we're already kind of placing so many bets, and that's what they're bets in that some point this technology will become reliable and great, that is extremely risky, because it's possible that they will never really be extremely smooth or extremely advantageous. It's also highly likely that they will never actually lead to more discriminate outcomes. And I think we're seeing already a little bit the consequences of having machines in the loop, but rather that they produce an environment in which the circle of violence is expanded rather than reduced. And we have to take into consideration that warfare is not a sanitized thing. It's always horrendous. It's horrendous. It is about trauma and suffering, and this trauma and suffering has big ripples, right? So, sometimes I worry that discussions about military technology are so sanitized and so removed from the actual reality of applying violence to bodies, to political contexts, to buildings, to habitats, to communities, that we're losing sight a little bit about what it is that we're engaging with, and that we're kind of like crafting a future around. in very uncertain ways.
Just quickly say, you mentioned the current situation, geopolitical situation. We have the war in Ukraine going on, the conflicts in other parts of the world. So, and obviously, and we can all agree on that, that the war in Ukraine has been a great accelerator for this technology. Specifically, it's, as you said, Elke, it's like this, sandbox, for lack of a better word, for this technology to thrive and to come to what it is today. The drones, as we know, have been deployed and are applied in this war on a great scale. And does the UK how has the UK reacted to this? I've heard France announced its, I believe, 2 billion euros investment in the defense sector until 2030. There are a bunch of AI startups that are currently working on some defense technology specifically for the French defense ministry. And has there been any commotion, so to speak, in the UK when it comes to this? Have people taken it seriously and are trying to work on their own type of technology specifically for that?
Yeah, it's more than a commotion. It's like a full-on tidal wave that has been kicked loose. I mean, just like in Europe, the UK has been for a long time, actually, since the beginning of the conflict, if not in some ways before, been very active and proactive in thinking about defense and updating defense and digital kind of technologies. But certainly, the last couple of years has kickstarted that initiative. And you read it in the Strategic Defense Review and other documents around that, the ways in which digital technology for defense purposes, and that includes drones, and that includes autonomous systems, not necessarily fully autonomous weapon systems, but autonomous systems, that will be prioritized. And the UK has just done some publicity around a project called Project Asgard, which is a digital targeting web. The UK has contracted with Anduril, a US military startup valued at, I don't even know what it is at the moment, like over 30 billion, maybe, I don't know. Quite an extraordinarily high valuation for certain systems. So I think the UK is very much involved in fortifying not only itself, but kind of the broader European context in light and together with Ukraine. And it should be, I want to say that, drones and increasingly AI capable or enabled drones have been tremendously significant in Ukraine being able to defend itself in this aggressive conflict, and mustn't be underestimated. To what degree, but it is still very much trial and error. The war is, for all intents and purposes, going on for far too long, but still not so long that we know exactly what works. Add to that the fact that there's a bit of a cat and mouse game going on between, new technologies being trialed and fielded and working, and then it's not long before that which has worked is then subverted or jammed or otherwise, kind of made redundant. So there's a sense by which the Ukraine serves as kind of like an example for how the wars of the future will be fought. And it serves also as a test bed for new technologies and a way by which one can see what works and what doesn't work. But there's also a sense by which we must be quite clear that perhaps the wars of the future are nothing like the context between Russia and Ukraine. And perhaps the wars of the future, all these, multi-domain, multi-number drone systems in large, like if you stockpile, let's say 100,000 loitering munitions, small ones, and intend to use them and they're AI enabled, they might be obsolete by the time the next conflict comes around. And so, this is why a lot of countries, including the US and also the UK, are beginning to think about infrastructure. So we need an industrial infrastructure so that we don't have to stockpile, so that we can kind of produce as we need. And that changes things quite significantly in terms of creating a wartime economy or a war-ready economy on which a country then comes to rely. So there's some interesting shifts that have been going on in the last 3 years since this conflict kind of started, and since this became almost the epitome of where innovation and defense is. But how this is all going to shake out in another 10 years, we don't know.
And about global shifts, you want to speak briefly about how have we seen so far this global shift of alliances, countries siding up with other countries we would never otherwise have imagined they would be. Why is it all happening? First of no pressure, but have we seen something like this before? And where do you think this might take us? As you mentioned, in 10 years, we don't know what's going to happen. But in the near future, I don't know. Let's say next year. Where do you see this all going?
So next year, I don't necessarily foresee much change, actually, except for perhaps a heating up of geopolitical tensions. But we have to, of course, remember that international affairs is international politics. It's about politics, right? And so you can do politics in various ways and in different ways. And I studied IR, international relations, and so there's this like very simple idea of the security dilemma. If your neighbor stockpiles a lot of weapons, you probably feel compelled to also stockpile some weapons because you don't know what they're up to. And then you get into this like arms race and suspicion situation. And that kind of undermines a sense of trust and diplomacy. And we're a little bit in that space right now where, trust is undermined, suspicion is elevated. And with every defense budget going larger and larger, and companies, I keep saying companies, I should not do that. Countries are investing primarily in defense and military infrastructure for good reason, but perhaps also, with a little bit of a lack of attention to the fact that you have to take care of your political and social infrastructure in order to avoid internal upheaval and in order to foster good relations across the immediate borders. I think the prioritization of that will make things a little bit more bumpy and unstable. And I think we have to be very careful about the language that we use in trivializing what warfare is ultimately about. So the one thing that worries me greatly, before I come to the possibilities of not being worried, the one thing that worries me greatly is that in some of the discourses that I follow, there is always this year 2027 raised where, it is assumed that because China is building out its military and it's about to have a big parade where it shows its military capabilities and strength, that in 2027, the idea is that China will come after Taiwan. And that will be the China-Taiwan conflict. And this is what the US is preparing for, to get involved in that. Now, when I read the war game scenarios, there is no good outcome. It's always disastrous. There is no way by which the US anybody can win without absolute horrific losses and destruction. But very often it is, although it was a war game itself, it's something that happens in the discourse as something quite abstract and clinical and something that can be engineered for. And I think without paying attention to the fact that we should do everything possible to avoid conflict rather than prepare for conflict, without cultivating what we can do to not have conflict, that it's a dangerous kind of environment. But of course, you can't sell technology to avoid having conflict. That's the problem, and there's a financial dimension to that. So I do think that perhaps there will be a possibility to, when the AI bubble inevitably bursts, even if it's just a small burst, but it will, because the valuations of the companies are extraordinary. We seem to see at the moment that the technological products are not really panning out in the glorious way that they have been promised. Especially today was an interesting day of some talking points. AI is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we need to slow down and embrace it, but mustn't expect too much, those kinds of things. So when the AI bubble inevitably busts, to some degree, perhaps there's an opportunity or an opening for a greater awareness of human relations and political relations, and taking care of the social and economic context of one's citizens' welfare as a crucial part of security. I mean, we haven't even talked about the climate yet, but those things that need to be taken care of.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're kind of reading my mind when you spoke about, the prognosis and about, conflict in Asia. And I think we also touched on that during our prep call, is that, it feels like our generation, we just kind of the, children and grandchildren of the post-World War, kind of a post-World War II order, right? So, I mean, I was raised by grandparents who were who were in that war, but it feels like 80 years have passed, and some sort of a new world order is being kind of established as we speak, because now we have players on the international arena that were not present after the conclusion of the World War II, when the Geneva Conventions were kind of and I'm just kind of venturing in this kind of into this international space, right, that you talked about, is like how countries collaborate, who the allies are. And at this point it feels like the global alliances are shifting, definitely. But I mean, I don't know, there's been a lot of criticism of the UN over the last couple of decades, but do you think, I mean, there is a certain group, within the international community that's working on this lethal autonomous weapons kind of definition, as trying to, come up with certain, I guess, parameters, how to possibly regulate those. Right now, they all fall under the existing like international laws and treaties that we have, but maybe there is a growing momentum for a new kind of international document. I mean, I don't know how effective that will be, but at least this understanding regarding this autonomous weapon system, so how they should be regulated or maybe banned altogether. That's probably not happening, right? Because they're already in play. But do you think there's a possibility of countries actually coming together and on a treaty like this? Because I think that the dangers of these systems are nothing that like we have seen before. Well, I mean, apart from nuclear weapons, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, pair those two, autonomous weapons with nuclear weapons, and you have a total catastrophe on your hands.
And then this planet takes over, right?
And then
that's the scenario. That's the elephant in the room, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I really do think so, and this is what we're working towards, and there are really sensible propositions and ways forward being offered and suggested. For example, a legally binding treaty, which suggests that maybe we should not use any of these autonomous weapon systems to target humans, because there are deep and profound ethical challenges to that. So those systems could be banned or should be banned, and all those systems that simply cannot be controlled, because that makes sense, right? So if there's no meaningful human control over a system, then it poses inherently a great peril. So those systems should also be banned. And then for anything else, perhaps object-focused things, we can talk about a different kind of regulation. And I know that many states are thinking quite clearly about this and are on board with some of these suggestions. And the urgency is clear to many, many states. It was evident in all the meetings that I've attended last year, and some of them this year as well. People are not taking that lightly. State representatives are not taking it lightly. It is just, unfortunately, very much a clash of interests. And, and unless you have the big, large producers on board, it becomes difficult. Nonetheless, I think it's important to set that signal, because you need that norm, right? You need at least a base layer of saying, we don't want this. This is a terrible idea. It makes life worse, not better for most of us. And so as a bottom line, this is the norm that we should try and agree on and should work with. And there's some really interesting initiatives underway, and people are, working really hard to make it happen.
Yeah, we have a question from Crispin. I'm just gonna read it out loud. The question is that whether this is even realistic, since these systems are being used in active combat and are no longer theoretical. Yeah, that's what I said. I mean, they're already in play. We have a bunch of countries that are employing those systems. I guess it's just a matter of degree, right? As Elke, as you mentioned, like when we start delegating our agency and our cognitive, function, so to speak, I guess it's just degree of how autonomous they are. I would think.
So the question really is actually to what degree they are fully in play, right? So you have an AI-enabled systems that can use AI in some autonomous mode to just do the last mile to avoid getting jammed or stopped in other ways. But fully autonomous systems are often not they're not widely in play, at least not that we know of. And that has a number of reasons. One of the reasons, and that's anecdotal because I can't really find much corroboration for a number of reasons, is that they're not reliable enough. So people are not comfortable using fully autonomous weapon systems because there's always a friendly fire issue, right? They're not as reliable and nimble and agile as systems as they're often hailed, fully autonomous weapon systems. Now, systems by which the human is somehow in the action loop, but in a very kind of like marginal way, like I mentioned, if they're just there to approve targets and kind of, say, yes, and that looks right based on these parameters, I guess, within 20 seconds, that is a quasi-autonomous weapons loop, but you still have a human in the loop. So to what degree fully autonomous weapon systems are in use, that is very much a question. And there isn't at this point evidence that they're widely used in any conflict. So there's time. But the drive is certainly there to go full speed ahead.
Yeah, and I guess the argument is that, as you mentioned, friendly fire, let's say that the system is in a better position, better equipped to identify those types of scenarios, as opposed to humans who are subject to all kinds of factors that the machine will not be. So yeah, there's so many arguments, and on both sides. We've all seen enough of sci-fi movies, I guess.
Yeah.
To think about those scenarios, but yeah.
We are already at the hour, so we'll have to unfortunately wrap this up, unless Elke wants to stay for another hour. But okay, perhaps next time. I just wanted to say that I really loved that you highlighted the importance of desanitizing this topic, because that's what I've noticed as well. It's sort of detached discussions around AI in the military, AI in warfare, with people sometimes meeting, perhaps intentionally, that real human beings are fighting the wars and real human beings are being hurt and are dying because of this tech at the end of the day, which is very important to keep in mind. And with that optimistic note, I would say thank you so much, Elke, for joining us today. It was a very great discussion, and as always, I learned a lot, and I hope our viewers and listeners did as well. And if anyone has any more questions to Elke, feel free to look her up on LinkedIn, and I'll post a link to the recording later today. But yeah, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone.